education. Delighted to have everybody present, and thank you for your participation, and just to also acknowledge Shira Mock's attendance and support for this process as representative of the CHSC, and we're delighted to be partnering them. Allow me just to say a quick word before we get on to our presenters today in this exciting topic of health system sciences on the series as a whole, the professional learning series. We're running this up, colleagues, to the 19th of October this year. Every week, essentially, well, in sets of threes, essentially, and each set of 3 weeks at 1600 hours on a Tuesday each time is dedicated to a particular theme. That we've tweaked it slightly from our presentations to date, in that the first of those sets of 3 sessions representing one theme will start next week. And it is with that, and the structure of those 3 is around first a health sciences education journal club to set the theme around a theoretical framework. Secondly, a Tech Tuesday to speak to 1 or 2 of the tools that can be used around that particular theme. And then thirdly, a learning workshop where we can get stuck in and our hands dirty with a few practical applications around that theme. So such exciting topics as OSCE, WBAs, workplace-based assessments, 21st century learning, student-centered designing around curriculum. We've got some good topics to come over the next few months. So please look out for that, and we'd be delighted to have your participation. So with that, let me dive straight in. I'm very happy to have Stephen and Catherine to present to us today around a particularly innovative and exciting space for well, I was going to say the School of Clinical Medicine for their links to the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, but really across the school, across the schools within the faculty, in this very new field that's currently at the moment nested within the Bachelor of Health Sciences, the Health System Sciences track. But without further ado, then across to you, Stephen and Catherine, and welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Richard, and welcome to everyone on the call. Thank you for joining us. So Catherine and I worked on this presentation. We were thinking of a metaphor that would be suitable for describing what we've been doing. And with some of the work that we've done previously on pandemic pangolins and now on our dreaming disruption with our dung beetle, the animal that came to mind was the meerkat. And we've called this presentation Meerkat Minds. And this meerkat was chosen as a metaphor because we see the meerkat as being highly resourceful, highly resilient, but also a team worker that is nimble and agile and fearless in the face of adversity. We know that meerkats love to eat scorpions. They often battle deadly cobras. And in fact, meerkats belong to the mongoose family. I found this by doing a quick Google search, and that they are actually immune to certain snake venoms. Nevertheless, we see that they rely on each other to stay alive in an arid environment where resources are often scarce. And a lot of this mirrors what we experience in trying to work in health systems and to teach around health systems. So we feel that we have a lot to learn from the meerkat as an example. And so what we want to do in this presentation is to look at the pressing need globally for critically trained health systems thinkers in the wake, obviously, of this unfolding global pandemic, where we can see that health systems across the globe or across the world are in crisis. And with this in mind, we will be looking at what the global drivers to develop health systems thinkers and how this movement has taken hold within our own faculty of health sciences. We're also going to showcase some of the work that we've done at WITS in developing health systems sciences as an emerging field of study. And we will look at the program in context by discussing the philosophical and pedagogical roots to our approach that we've been applying to teaching health systems and systems thinking. So to begin with, I have 2 questions. Why is this not changing? There we go. Okay, sorry. technologically challenged. Oh no, now it's changing too quickly. Okay, so the two questions that we came up with were just questions we thought we would put at the back of people's minds as we present through the content. And we know that a lot of our colleagues on the call are teaching courses of their own or are responsible for managing programs. And the first thing we would like you to think about are what aspects of health systems are taught on your course. And are these aspects taught explicitly, or do they form part of a hidden curriculum? Is it something that
is very interesting?
Sorry, Catherine. Oh.
I think Catherine's able to mute. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So we want to see whether this is something that is thought through as an explicit part of what you teach, or is it something that is almost an outcome that we expect students to learn how the system works by learning about aspects of it, but we don't explicitly teach it. And the second thing we want to think about are, well, really, it's what is this, the creature or the graduate that we create at the end of a program. And we want to think about this in terms of competencies. What competencies are articulated as indicative of a typical graduate within your program? And are these competencies explicit? And we know that in many health science education programs, those competencies are more defined and outlined by things like the HPCSA that say that these are the kinds of skills that need to, or skills and competencies that a medical graduate, for example, need to have. What we found with trying to think about non-clinical graduates within a health science space is that these competencies are in fact not articulated very clearly. And this has formed part of our thinking in terms of how we've built our curriculum around what kind of person are we trying to achieve and what skills do they need. And this is in fact, I will selfishly admit, is forming the basis of my own PhD to try articulate a competency framework for non-clinical graduates. So more on that later, hopefully something exciting and productive. So when we were thinking about why we need global health systems thinkers, we can see that given our current circumstances with the COVID-19 pandemic, that many health systems are being described as being in a state of crisis. And last week I went through some news articles that I Googled very quickly online to see what kinds of issues were emerging. And many of these issues, and I've just taken some snippets here of a few things that came up. The first one reads, cash-strapped Africa overwhelmed by COVID-19 vaccine challenge. Many of the issues here have nothing necessarily to do with the clinical provision of care, but it has to do with a system that supports that provision of care. For example, the health economics or financing behind a big scheme such as the vaccine rollout. This one by Fauci, where he says, the world has failed India, says Fauci, as COVID-19 cases surges. And what Fauci was talking about here is that how can a country such as India, that is responsible for the biggest production of vaccines in the world, not have enough vaccines for its own people? What has happened in terms of global and social capital that has put India in such a dire situation? Another article directly related to the crisis that India is currently going through says that India's COVID-19 catastrophe reflects years of neglect in health systems. And I think this, if we changed the word India with many other countries, we would see that in fact that would be true for many circumstances, including our own. And the ramifications obviously come to the fore in times of crisis. And so we see these issues emerging. This article looked slightly different. It was looking at the EU's response to COVID-19 and what they could possibly learn from it. And they were saying that the health workforce crisis should be a priority in the EU's COVID-19 recovery plan, that we need to recognize that our health workforce is absolutely essential. And the extent of that health workforce is something that we can consider here. Of course, human resources for health is one of the core domains that we teach in health system science. And then a last one, and I can go on and on and on, but this one is from a WHO report, and it says COVID-19 continues to disrupt essential health services in 90% of countries. And I think what this points to is that globally, health systems are fragile, and when they are put in times of crisis, we see that they start to fracture at the edges, and that when it comes to something like essential health services, our services need to continue regardless of sudden changes. How those services are so radically affected when we are put in times of crisis. So we can see that, oopsie daisy, that not only do these headlines point to the crisis in global health systems, but that they highlight a myriad of systematic problems that place huge strain on clinical care and ultimately on health outcomes. And this is why we feel that there is a need for health system sciences. So why do we need health system sciences, and why do we need it now? When we were developing health system science, we relied on the one and only textbook that we could find on the subject by Skolchalak and colleagues in the US, who conducted a systematic review of, I think it was 11, maybe it was 19 medical school programs in the States. And what they did is they looked at what aspects of health systems are taught, where are they taught, and how are they taught. And they realized that there's a need to be more explicit around how we teach issues around health systems. And here they were aiming at specifically at clinical students. And what they recognized is that health systems are constantly in flux and constantly changing. And despite the fact that they need to be agile and flexible in times of crisis, as we see now, they also need to be stable and supportive. And that there are many instances in which that have challenged the way that traditional health systems have been set up, and that how these things how our health system has to evolve in the face of substantial and shifting challenges. Some of the examples that they give is that our population or patient population is expanding and is more diverse than what was perhaps envisaged when many of the structures within our health systems were developed. That our populations are aging rapidly, that we see an increase in chronic diseases. This is very true in our context, and often there's a link with determinants of health, and that there are multiple comorbidities that complicate the patient experience through the health system. They also recognize that health systems are evolving in the wake of huge technological advances in digital revolution, and that this is a two-way street. That as there are advances in technology, we see shifts in health systems, and as there are shifts in health systems, we see advances in technology. They said at the same time, social, political, and economic forces have become integral to the transformation of health systems, and that there's a strong relation between these different aspects that are external, perhaps external, but fundamental to how the health system functions. And here I'd like to draw on the work of Barnett that has been at the forefront of my mind recently around how we define complexity. And Barnett says that health, he doesn't say this explicitly, he says it in the context of the university. And I'm reading his book called Realizing the University in an Age of Super Complexity. He says that health systems are not merely complex, but they are super complex. He defines complexity as a state of affairs in which demands before one exceed the resources to meet them. And he explains that complex issues are relatively easy to solve if those resources become available. However, in terms of super complexity, this arises under conditions of a conceptual overload that are a result of the outcomes of a multiplicity of frameworks, where we have overlapping ways of thinking and being in the world, interacting at the same point in time. And we can't just simply throw resources at the problem in order to fix it. And what does this mean for health science education? In order to address many of the health system challenges that we see through a transformative education, so our role as a faculty for training professionals into the future, health profession students as well as educators need to prioritize adaptive critical thinking. And it should be made more explicit and taught throughout the curriculum. And this is really what we've been trying to do in health system sciences. When we look at what is taught typically in Faculty of Health Sciences, we see that there are these different modes of knowledge. And this image on the left kind of locates where we have placed health system science and the content that relates to it. Again, here I'm drawing on Barnett, who refers to Gibbons, and he talks about different historical modes of knowledge in higher education. The first is this mode 1 form of knowledge, which we see in the blue circle, our basic sciences. This is a systematic corpus of knowledge, or the canonic work that is contained in particular disciplines. So in any clinical discipline, the first few years are taken up with those core fundamental knowledge disciplines that form the basis of their education: biology, microbiology, anatomy, physiology, those sorts of things. Later on, of course, that forms the basis in which clinicians, or clinical students at least, are able to develop their clinical skills, and upon which they build those clinical skills. And that's the green circle, the clinical sciences, which is a mode 2 form, according to Gibbons, of thinking. This emerges out of knowledge-based work where knowledge is applied to practical situations. This is knowledge in use, or knowledge for problem solving. For example, how we develop clinical skills in later years in medical education. But our argument is, in fact, there is perhaps maybe not a third mode, but a third pillar in relation to these different modes of thinking. And this is where complexity of knowing is put onto the agenda. These are the kinds of issues that are pragmatic, tactile, and communicative forms of knowledge and knowledge practice. And this is where we kind of have located a lot of the content that we teach around health system science. It's a context in which these two other forms of knowledge are taught and how they play out. And we can see this overlap between that way of thinking, that those communicative forms of knowledge and basic sciences. It's certainly not to refute the need for basic sciences, but it is, for example, to say that if the basic sciences are the stable baseline of medical education, it's still important for health science students to know where those forms of knowledge came from, to know that those forms of knowledge are in fact contested, that there are other ways of thinking in relation to that, even if that forms the baseline or the basis upon which you develop your entire professional capacity. And that is one of the key aspects of health systems. So if we take this, we can apply a further metaphor, and here I've drawn on Skolchalak and colleagues again to show that the content of health system science is all that other stuff that is below the water if we look at our iceberg metaphor. So at the tip of the metaphor, of course, or tip of the iceberg, we have the care that is provided ultimately to individual patients, and that's what clinicians are taught to do. But the context in which they provide that care is what lies beneath the water. And right at the base of this iceberg, we see that the deepest and coldest part of the ocean is the systems thinking. The water around which the iceberg floats, if you like, is our systems thinking, that these things are interrelated, shifting, complex, and changing. But the kinds of content domains that are focused on, and this might be more explicit in our particular teaching, but it's no different in many other programs. Teamwork, collaboration, team science, or teaming, as is referred to later. Health systems integration, leadership, determinants of health, healthcare policy, economics, health systems improvement, the population of, health population, population health, the different populations we can focus on, value in healthcare, and proactive person-centered or patient-centered care. There's more clinical informatics. There's a bunch of other aspects, and we'll talk more to those content domains a little bit. Actually, now, my next slide actually looks at how those content domains are envisaged in a framework. So when we were developing the content for health system sciences 1, 2, and 3, the 3 courses, we looked to this particular framework. And what we liked about it is that this is actually an adapted framework. This is the second iteration of it. Initially, it did not have patient, family, and community at the center. So I'm really glad to see that that's been brought into it. It really is also the heart of family medicine, and rightfully why this program is taught in family medicine. But around which we see that there are core domains. These are really the core content issues, many of which are resting in that iceberg. These are things like systems improvement, value in healthcare, population and public health or determinants of health, clinical informatics and health technology, again, responding to the fact that as technologies shift and evolve, so do health systems. Things such as healthcare policy, health financing, and health economics. I know those two things are separate, but we do focus on them in conjunction. And the structures themselves, how the health system is actually structured, what are the processes, and ultimately the purpose of health system science is to improve patient outcomes, which is essentially the goal of any clinical discipline. Well, maybe that could be up as a point of contention. And then around those core content domains, we have our cross-cutting domains. These are aspects that cut across these different content areas. In the initial framework, in fact, there were more than these 4, and we've used these cross-cutting domains to develop or be more articulate around the competencies that we want our graduate to exhibit. And we're working on defining those competencies more articulately in terms of what that would actually look like. So, for example, teaming is mentioned as a cross-cutting domain, and this includes things such as communication and collaboration. But what communication looks like for a non-clinical graduate is quite different to what it might look like for a medical graduate, where communication might be between a clinician and a patient around a patient's reason for encounter and their outcomes. For a non-clinician, it's often about communication between the different levels of the health system, between different cadres within the health system, perhaps through mechanisms such as health policy, for example. So we're still trying to figure out, and this is evolving work. Other ones include leadership. I had to twist my head to read this, ethics and legal issues, and change agency management and advocacy. And I'll show how that articulated later into our own thinking around particular competencies that we've used to structure very articulately different learning points within our curriculum. And then around this entire framework, we've got, again, the water in which the iceberg floats, this systems thinking or critical thinking, if you like, and how these different aspects link and shift and change as the context shifts and changes. So practically what this looks like and the mechanism through which we are trying to teach this is through the Bachelor of Health Science degree program. That program has a standard first year where all students learn our Mode 1 form of knowledge, including what we call in Health System Science 1, the foundations of health systems, the foundations of public health, and the foundations of health ethics. We teach that in the first year. It's a half course, and we dangle it in front of all BHSE students to try get interest and get them to bite at this exciting domain of knowledge. If students decide to take this, they then are moved into a track in health system science. And this is shared between ultimately between public health and family medicine. But in the second year, they do a combined anatomy physiology course. They do a full course in public health that articulates into a full course in third year. That should say third year. Jonas, please take note of this on our diagram. And of course, Health System Science 2 becomes a full major Health System Science 3. So we have quite a lot of space in the curriculum to be teaching these content areas. So when it came to teaching these issues, we thought about the approach that we would use or the philosophy of teaching that informs how we wish to teach this. And here again, I would like to make reference to the work of Barnett. And what Barnett says is that in an age of super complexity, the mission of the university has shifted to one that offers particular ways of assimilating or generating knowledge. And Barnett suggests that there are 4 dimensions of epistemological life that could serve to legitimate this particular role within the university. The first is by providing revolutionary accounts of the world, which I'll talk to now. Second is creating opportunities for critical commentating. The third is building a therapeutic epistemology, and finally, a pedagogy of action or critical action that facilitates change in the world. So what do we mean when we talk about revolutionary accounts of the world? Supercomplexity is marked by an abundance of new accounts of the world, things that are constantly shifting and changing. There are new images, new technologies developing, new forms of text, new discourses emerging, but also importantly, and perhaps productively, are new and evolving forms of professional life. What we teach our students today to become the professions to which we wish them to become might not be what they practice in the future. And it's likely that many of the professions are going to continue to evolve and shift and change as the world becomes more complex and new opportunities emerge. At the same time, the university is in a position to rethink or to produce radically new forms of understanding. And necessarily so, given our calls to decolonize institutions and to rethink what is the basis of the curricula that we use through these institutions to teach different particular forms of knowledge to be productive in particular ways. So there really is a challenge here. This was written in 1996 or 7 or something like that, and Barnett was already recognizing the fact that there are challenges to the way that universities are structured in terms of the production of knowledge. And we can really, we've been taking this quite seriously in our thinking about what is it that we teach, what lens do we use through which to teach that, and how can our course contribute to this call to decolonize our universities. But also that health science education, quite particularly, also requires some revolutionary reframing in order to open up opportunities to consider seriously other forms of medical knowledge and knowledge production or knowledge practice and production. And here I really am making reference to the wealth of knowledge that we sit with in this country from African traditional forms of knowledge and other forms of knowing and knowledge practice that have been negated or downplayed over centuries that could be of huge value to our students. So we have been taking this seriously, and we've thought about this in terms of how we would apply this in these 3 courses in health system science. And we do this by applying different lenses to view the health system at different points in time through the curriculum. For example, we apply an historical lens where we, through the role of health systems, through medical humanities, this emerging discipline in our faculty, we are able to think about the context in which health systems emerged. And Catherine can talk more about this in a little bit more detail when we give some examples. But what we've done, for example, is teach very digestible historiographies of medicine, and also situating our own health system in South Africa from an historical perspective over the last 300 years. And that gives context to the challenges that students are, or that the health system faces, or that we present to students, so they can make sense of where those challenges have come from. Another important lens is that of the ethical lens. We've worked quite closely with the Steve Biko Center, and this is also in terms of continuity, trying to build on that foundation that we form in the first year around an ethical and critical thinking. And that we have to always, there are different ways of seeing problems from an ethical and legal perspective. Here again, we are able to bring in alternative ways of thinking or different healing modalities in which to position, not necessarily against, but to position alongside biomedical forms of practice, to say that our health system is invested in biomedicine in particular ways at the expense of other healing modalities. But if we start to place these 2 things together, or if we start to see our health system through the lens of an alternative form of healing, how does that look? What does that do? What does it elicit? How might that also be a root cause for some of the challenges we experience? And an important lens we also focus on is advocacy. Ultimately, to be revolutionary is to form change, and advocacy is a mechanism through which to do that. And we show opportunities for change through an advocacy lens. As we start to see problems, it's easy to describe things as problems and challenges. harder to articulate those as solutions or to show how those solutions might in themselves create problems. And those are the kinds of issues I think we talk about quite seriously. The second epistemological view that Barnett talks about is the self-critical commentating. And a few weeks ago, I actually can't quite remember when it was, we invited Professor Nichols from the Writing Center to talk about writing in our curricula. So what, and this is the image I've got here, I'll talk to it now. What critical commentating refers to is that because new forms of knowledge are proliferating, there are many platforms in which knowledge is produced, Wikipedia and social media, and it's, I think I can't name them all. The world and what we see in the world has become increasingly contestable. And therefore, with these new forms of knowledge and new forms of knowledge production, it's important for us to have a critical scrutiny on what is being said, what are the arguments that are being made, in order to call these forms of knowledge to account for any claims that they make on the world. And this is really where the role of critical thinking through writing comes in. What we've done in health system science is develop our 3 courses as writing intensive courses. And we've developed these critical reasoning and argumentation skills through writing, where we see writing as developing critical thinking. And the image on the screen is the rhetorical triangle that Professor Nichols made reference to in terms of thinking about how arguments are positioned and framed. This is from our first year, for example, and we build this through in their writing all the way through to what they produce in their final year. Another area is, of course, that again around advocacy, that one of the cross-cutting focuses is on health advocacy, where students are given the skills to comment critically about issues that emerge in the health system. For example, we've used the Life is Many crisis as a key moment in which we need to advocate for change in our health system. Right, and the third area is around what Barnett refers to as a therapeutic epistemology. And I think this comes from the recognition that in an era of super complexity, we might be left with a sense of nihilism or essentially uncertainty about the world. And that super complexity is an era that proliferates with precarity and uncertainty. And as such, our sense of who we are and our relationship to others often can feel insecure. And you can see I've got this image of a family of meerkats all bonding together to form a sense of unity. So if this is a context in which we're teaching or just describing health systems, it can seem almost alienating to students. So Barnett suggests that we should focus on the concept of being, and it should overtake this idea of knowledge as an epistemological concept. In order to do this, pedagogies are required that provide the capacities for coping with super complexity, which encourage the formation of human being that maintains a purposive equilibrium in the face of radical uncertainty. So taking all that jargon and trying to make sense of it in health system science, what we've done is take the lived experience of students very seriously. They're being human as paramount to their experience of learning and becoming a thing through our course, or a certain kind of person. And we do this by really bringing the humanity back to medical education, medical thought and practice, through ways of teaching, for example, with our emphasis on medical humanities. And we also try to develop self-reflexivity in, this is nothing new to many programs, I'm sure, but we do this actually by making it the forefront of our assessment. And what we've done is get rid of high stakes exams and replace it with an e-portfolio of learning that is essentially a portfolio of evidence of learning, an experiential portfolio of how students have learned, what they've learned, and what that learning has come to mean to their understanding of the world. Knowing that we might teach a particular health policy now as a good example to explain how policy works, and knowing that in 5 years' time that policy will no longer be relevant. It might be dropped, it might be substituted, it might be developed or changed as things change. Okay, and then the last area, again building on Barnett, is a pedagogy for critical action. So it's important that we enable our students to develop not just competence, but confidence to enact those competencies, and to act purposively in an environment where things are uncertain, where things are precarious and changing, and where everything is possibly changeable. And how do we build that confidence in these competencies that we are structuring in our curriculum? So we've done this by developing particular kinds of competencies that give students confidence to apply critical thought and action in different types of contexts through different lenses, and where they can see how different ideas emerge and evolve. So the image I've got is actually our logo for health system science. These are the different competencies, and I can't remember what they all are offhand. I should have written this down, but the top one is a cog in a person's head. There we have our systems thinker. Down below that we've got communication, we have management, we have responsible leadership, we have advocacy, we have scholarship, we have collaboration, and those kinds of issues. And we've tried to link this with a nexus, a web of links between how these things are cross-cutting through the content that students are learning. And so importantly, when we do this, it's done with these three preceding epistemological stances in mind. So when new forms of action might be required, in other words, our revolutionary accounts of the world, we have to also recognize that there's a need for these forms of knowledge to be subject to scrutiny through critical commentating, while allowing for some form of emotional equilibrium. We can't let students feel completely out of place in the world. And that's the role of our therapeutic epistemology. And if we put these three together, it gives a new valence, I guess, for how knowledge in use can be used to convert or shift or change things into critical action in the health system. And this is perhaps the last time I'll make reference to Barnett, but one of the quotes that I found quite telling is that the modern world needs not just competent doctors. We can teach skills to anybody, but doctors who can interrogate their own actions within a range of critical perspectives, and who are able to envisage entirely new forms of professionalism. And if we replace the word doctor with a health system scientist or health system science student, this quote would ring equally true. So let's move to how our students have engaged or experienced this content. And I just went through what we build in some self-reflection, or actually not self-reflection, some feedback for the different sessions. Yannis actually instituted this in Health System Science 1 with great effect. Sorry, Yannis, that I didn't use one of your examples, but there were so many to draw upon. And that was really where students could reflect on what they had learned and what they felt from this. And I've included two quotes here from our most recent engagement with the clinical associate students from BCMP 2 and 3, where we've been trying to build some of this content into a clinically focused discipline. And this is a most recent one that came out of some work we did describing the history of health systems or the emergence of biomedicine. And the student said, I found this session quite interesting. At least that was important. So far, it's shown me how topics such as religion and or the creation of tertiary institutions that I never would have linked to medicine actually played significant roles interchangeably in the development of medicine and education today. The length of the text and the jargon used have made going through the sessions a little daunting, and I'll take full responsibility for that, as would Catherine. But it has still been very interesting and has opened my eyes to how medicine originated in history. We couldn't have asked for better feedback from our students in terms of what has been meaningful to them. This was one of, I think, 2 or 3 sessions that we managed to put into the curriculum, and this is the response we got. This second one is from a BHSC 1 student on critical thinking, who said, "This was an amazing session because it identified some of the main cognitive biases, which are so fascinating. I also learned about how to become a more critical thinker and how you can do so." So we feel we've achieved our goal there. And the last one, where we taught BCMP 2 students on health systems, this presentation showed me that there is a lot of different roles needed to have a well-functioning health system. It showed me that as a clinical associate student, I have to uphold myself and pride myself in my work, so as to be part of a great team that ensures a better life for patients. We are also a priority in achieving a well-functioning health system. These kinds of thoughts are quite humbling for us, but also exciting, that we feel that this small project is having the effect that we're hoping to achieve. Catherine, at this point, I think I'd like to hand over to you if you would like to expand on this, given that this was some of the work that you did.
Thank you so much. I don't think I will take up too much time, Stephen, because you've really elucidated this so clearly, and I'm sure people have got questions. But just to say that if you can leave the last slide on, one of the things that really blew my socks off last year is that we had already planned before the epidemic hit us, and we weren't quite aware that the pandemic would shut down the world when we began putting this into or stitching this into our material. I wanted to show the students how the South African health system after 1910 developed in response to the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919. And I wanted to show them how it looked both back in time to medieval, early modern, Asian, colonial, imperial, and also pre-colonial African knowledge about adaptability. I wanted to show all the different strands. And then the pandemic hit us. We had to go completely online. And I was never able again to see the students face to face in the course of the whole of last year. And of course, this year, things haven't been very different. So what I was able to do, I think, was to show them without any huge acrobatics on my part or your part, the requirement for a constant nimbleness and attentiveness to the structures beneath knowledge. Since Thomas Kuhn wrote his very important book about the way in which science and clinical knowledge evolves through paradigmatic shifts, most programs in the world that look at the history and philosophy of clinical science, and of medicine have paid attention to this, not because they think that it denudes clinical medicine or science or nursing of any power, but quite the opposite, because this becomes a really important form of knowledge in motion, and it boosts people's sense of ability to interrogate the world and to find out about the puzzles that are nested inside of complexity, inequality, division, but that also explain, rather than great man theories or hagiographies, why it is that certain scientific advances are so persuasive and so persistent, and that we feel such confidence in. So it's a combination of the two. And I really feel that we've begun to get it right with the BSc students and with the BCMP students. We've got a long way to go, I'm sure, Stephen, you and I, but the door that's been opened also for medical and health humanities in this space is, I think, also enriching their sense of purposefulness, professional practice, and their understanding that the contradictions that we face in our current world are not inevitable, and they also have a background that can be understood and apprehended. So I think I'll just leave the comments there and see what our colleagues would like to ask us a bit more about. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I realized I was very ambitious and I went over my time quite a bit. Apologies for that. But let's, if we can open it up to questions. I see there are a number of comments actually that I've just been reading through that are very encouraging.
Perhaps you can speak to a couple of those comments if you would like, Stephen, just to pick up on that, and then we'll get some questions if people would like to put up their hands.
Certainly. I mean, so the first is, just a point that Giannis is making at the end here, that the feedback I gave was really for specific sessions. We were trying to get a sense of whether our sessions were achieving their outcomes really, but they actually gave us a better sense of what was going on. And but he says it's difficult to focus on all the competencies in any one session, which makes sense. But that we also need to figure out ways, I think, importantly, of assessing whether what we set out as competencies are enabled, and how we would assess, how we would evaluate whether those competencies are being achieved, and whether they are I guess being being able to have impact. And I see Shabir made comments also about, sorry, Shabir, I'm trying to trace this around the need to develop social activists, that students don't seem to reflect on responsible leadership or responsive decision making, and that it would be useful to track BHSC students, both HSS and non-HSS, through medical school to see the career paths and and their approach to health systems and how they cope with it. I think this is a fantastic suggestion and also an important project. This course is so new in its inception that we don't know what our graduates are going to be doing or where they end up, and it definitely is our intention to be tracing our graduates to see where they work and what impact they have and how they go about doing that. Yeah.
Stephen,
I wonder if you can share. Sorry, just on the back of that, and well, Catherine, go ahead, and then I'll pick it up.
No, go ahead, Richard. I can come back. I just wanted to append a point onto what Stephen was saying to Shabir.
But please do.
I just wanted to amplify what Stephen's saying and agree with Shabir that we need to obviously research this very closely. But colleagues on this call will be more aware than I am even that there's been a lot of research in the last 25 years or so in Southern Africa about what happens to people as they emerge as health and clinical professionals, the struggles that they have to maintain their vision, to name and to resource and to nourish their calling, to continue to feed their sense of commitment and ambition, both as clinician researchers, but also as excellent practitioners as they go forward. Burnout, a lack of purposefulness, confusion about the different roles that they have. We could go on. The South African Medical Journal is just one publication that has honestly in a way platformed this sense of crisis in qualified health professionals in our region, and this is after they've been through nursing school or medical school and so on and so forth. So one of the things that I think is so interesting to put into the space is the contradistinction, the examples that we have from other places, also very complex societies, for example, such as big cities with a lot of poverty and complexity and inequality in North America, particularly universities in the Indian subcontinent. And one of the things I've always been struck by is how much more students who are qualified health professionals from those places know about the history of their own health systems, which allows them to get some critical distance upon and also continues to fertilize their sense of agency in the particular health system they find themselves in. Just an absolutely classic example for me is that wherever I've traveled abroad, including to India, to Cuba, to North America, to Edinburgh in Scotland, people will know about the history, for example, of social medicine in Southern Africa. They'll know a huge amount about the particular kind of Scottish medical missionaries whose activism and whose imagination really fueled health systems in Southeast Africa. They'll know the connections across the Indian Ocean between particular trajectories in public health, for example, in India and South Africa. But our own students, this is considered peripheral knowledge or not important or not taught. And I think that these are very grave mistakes. Yes, it's true that there are only, 24 hours in a day and a night, but the choices that we are making are choices that I think we might be regretting in the present. And we can, even with our 10 years of research about how health system sciences are doing, we can look to other similar complex, mixed economy, highly bifurcated, sometimes by race, sometimes by caste or class, forms of education in the rest of the world and practice, and we can draw lessons from them. And I really do think our students are saying to us that this is valuable knowledge. It's not easy knowledge. It's complex, but it's valuable. Yeah, I'll keep quiet there. Over to you, Richard.
Just to, perhaps you could both comment on, I've had right at the beginning, at the inception of our thinking around putting a HSS course track together within the Bachelor of Health Sciences, I had a couple of comments. I recall quite an eminent public health specialist from Pretoria, from the University of Pretoria, spoke about how, no, health system sciences needs to be considered at a postgraduate level and taught at a postgraduate level. And what for you, Stephen, is the novice versus master in health system sciences? I'm mindful that you've spoken about the being able to look at health systems through different lenses, in different ways, with reference to medical history, etc. And perhaps the interdependence of how everything works at a later stage in their development of competence. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, Richard, I think that's a good way of framing it, that in order to make sense of complexity, you need to know the component parts, and you need to know the complexity within those component parts. And we could take any one of the content domains and really have a field day. And in fact, many of those content domains are entire disciplines unto themselves, because this approach is interdisciplinary. It's drawing on knowledge from different contexts and making it applicable to the health setting. And this is a question, of course, that we're seeing now, just for those on the call, to know that we are in the process of developing an honors and a master's course with that streams out of this undergraduate. And it is about distinguishing the levels of knowledge and the extent to which that knowledge becomes much more applied and practical. So in some ways, I think our undergraduate program actually is in many ways a mode one form of knowledge. That is those component parts, but as we progress into our third year, we try and move towards through this systems thinking approach towards the interconnection or interrelationships between these different component parts, and how if you throw a curveball, for example, into the mix, how that shifts or change, and how we can predict perhaps what an outcome might be, and how we might manage those any kind of unintended consequences. And we also try to teach quite practical things, so a certain set of like tools or skills for thinking or understanding complex adaptive systems. So how does one articulate different root causes, and what happens, again, I guess around unintended consequences. With the very predictive models, we can't always see how things are going to unfold, or we can't always account for shifts and changes. So that's where, again, the lens becomes so important. It's like, what happens when we start to see this from a different perspective? Does it shift the way that we think about a particular issue? Another thing that we've tried to do, in fact, is develop the content in kind of in modular fashion, where it becomes pliable or flexible, so that it can be applied to different contexts. And our proof of concept here is working with our clinical associates to say, in the context of the work that clinical associates do particularly, and the issues that emerge from that, in terms of their sense of professional identity, their role in the health system, their relationship to other cadres of healthcare, how can what we teach strengthen their resolve and their identity? How can it, I guess, bolster their being in the world, but also their sense of purpose and their understanding of systems challenges and so on and so forth. And I feel quite strongly that kind of flexibility that we built into the curriculum is one of its strengths. It could and can, hopefully this is a resource that can be applied to other programs in the discipline. Catherine, do you want to add to that?
Just a side point, and that is related. Comments are coming up about a variety of supportive points. And one that I just wanted to draw people's attention to for a minute was Tluma Makunga's point, which I think also related to Richard's comment about the prof from Pretoria phoning and saying, really this is postgraduate work, it's not foundational. One of the things that does, of course, happen is that all areas or domains of knowledge can be scaled down and scaled up and done at different spaces. For example, people can learn to play the violin to concert level when they are 14, but they might not have the emotional maturity to be the fully fledged musician they'll be one day. And we could say the same thing about people who write a first novel under 25, or the Elon Musks of the world who begin to have a vision of a particular scientific utopianism when they are not even 21. And then to bake them in and to make them have valiance that connects up with others and that leads to something fundamental and change is obviously the work of many iterations and of other forms and layers of knowledge. So of course one would never say that some of these domains are not valuable at the graduate level. But the question that we have to ask is, why should they also be planted in the early years of education? And for me, one of the reasons is that if you only attach these to the postgraduate space or the graduate already space, what that drives people towards is, and it's nothing to do with them as personal individuals, it sets up a platform that drives them towards particular kinds of consultancy and management spaces with very high salaries and projects them into a different entity. And that's wonderful and that's powerful for them. But how much does that change everyday experience at the grassroots level, at a clinic level, or even in a very high-tech space such as a research laboratory, say, based on the campus of Krisani Baragwanath? It doesn't. And that's what we keep seeing happening in our society at so many different levels. I'll just give you one example from Malawi, a country that many of you might know. Because they build more HSS type stuff into their undergraduate and very early graduate work, my impression is that there's a much more nimbleness across the sector. I've had students who've come to do a master's, for example, in medical humanities from Malawi, and you don't have to begin with the conceptual stuff as if they were novices. And they do research in areas that don't have the same kind of financial support or the kind of whole setup, for example, that a place like Agincourt would have, let alone the so-called rural space of Soweto that Shabir mentioned earlier. And yet they're able to quickly perform at much higher levels of research and interrogation of knowledge, because some of these systematic and critical ways of thinking have been baked into their work earlier on, and they pass our students, who in many ways are more privileged, quite quickly, I find, in their 5th or 6th year of study. So these are just some impressions that I share with colleagues, and especially in response to Tluma and of course to Richard.
Colleagues, did we lose Catherine or is it me?
Yeah, she muted herself, it seems.
Oh, no, I ended my sentence by passing the baton back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. And thank you for those inputs. Yes, some very interesting discourse coming out here and very interesting points being made in the chat. Thank you. Pleased to see the presence of our clinical associate colleagues as well from the Division of Clinical Associates on the call, who no doubt are relating to the exciting innovations that our colleagues have introduced with you around this interprofessional space and bringing HSS competencies or development of them for our clinical associates. Scott, is that working? Is that perhaps a comment from one or two of your team for Stephen and Catherine's inputs, if I may? Is Aviwe on the call, or yourself for that matter?
Good. Thank you, Richard. Yes, no, I'm here, and Aviwe and Victor also, and I saw Valentine earlier, but please welcome to have them join in. I'm so pleased, yes, Stephen, on what you guys have been describing and the comments that you put up there about the BCMP students. I was just with one of our new associate lecturers. She was asking about how do we develop clinical reasoning in our students, and clinical judgment. And I think that critical thinking that you're developing through this is a way that it parallels into the clinical space for that clinical reasoning. And it gives them, really the context of understanding the social issues of our patients, and, even the mannerisms within the hospital, the clinics, and how people are operating. And I think Aviwe will say much more around then the professional identity of the clinical associate, within that context as we develop this profession. Thanks so much, Stephen and Catherine. Really been enjoying listening.
Aviwe, just to pick up on that professional identity, is there some help that this particular HSS approach and inputs and content and curriculum can help with that work? For that, I know you did an excellent master's research project on this very topic within health sciences education.
Yes, it does. Definitely, it does make a difference. It does help the students, just for them to understand the context in which they're learning in. And as we saw, I think one example, a lot of the students have been giving positive remarks about the HSS activities that they've been given. So it does contribute, and I think in the long run, it will contribute to enhancing their professional identity. So we're excited to do more than what we've done so far. Thank you.
And I thank you, Aviwe, and to Scott. And I think Catherine and Stephen, we're excited to do more is a good place to finish, because there is so much more, isn't there? And I think we can all be really excited about the prospects and the path that we're planning. And much is uncertain at this stage for health system sciences. So my thanks to both of you for these inputs. Allow me to please suggest that this is the first of many such engagements, because really we can grow together and develop this collectively, for it all being so new and exciting for all of us. So it's really not the space or the area for any one or two or three of us, but I think this whole set of competencies and the like, and how it can improve and develop our competencies in other disciplines, as we've heard from you, and in terms of our pedagogical approaches as well, is really a very exciting collaborative space for all of us. So colleagues, our thanks to all of you for participating. Regretfully, we have to end now for time constraints. But our thanks again to Catherine and Stephen, and I remind all of you, please, to join us on our next theme of in the DFMPC professional learning series. That is specifically around student-centered design of curricula. Am I correct, Yanis? Did we have that as our next exciting theme of 3?
Yes, Prof. It's student-centered curriculum design with Carol presenting.
And so we've got Carol Hartman and Manto Makachana, the director of UMI. And Carol is, of course, leading our curriculum review around MBCHB 1 and 2, under the direction of Linda Lani Mguni and colleagues within the deanery. She's been earmarked for that. So that's an exciting space. And indeed, the HSS work will be heavily involved. I mean, that will be informing some of their thinking, some of our thinking around the curriculum review and the MBCHB space as well. So let's look forward to having you all engage next week, Tuesday, in that theme of student-centered curriculum design. Thank you, colleagues, for your participation, and good evening to you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much.